Emma Hawthorne came home early that Tuesday. A canceled meeting, nothing more. But the moment she stepped inside, she heard something that stopped her cold. Her son laughing. A real laugh, loud and free, the kind she hadn't heard in 3 years. Not since the day his father died. She followed the sound to her late husband's study, the room no one had entered since the funeral. Through the half-open door, she saw her gardener standing at a whiteboard, explaining concepts that belonged in a university lecture, while her 9-year-old listened with bright eyes. Who was this man? And what was he hiding? 6 months before that Tuesday, Daniel Carter arrived at the Hawthorne estate with nothing but a worn duffel bag and a 7-year-old boy holding his hand. The hiring manager barely glanced at his resume, a sparse document listing odd jobs and no college degree. But the mansion needed a groundskeeper, and Daniel needed a place where no one would ask questions. He got the job the same afternoon. The small cottage at the edge of the property came with it, just big enough for a father and son trying to disappear. The Hawthorne mansion was the kind of place that looked beautiful in photographs, but felt hollow in person. 12,000 square feet of marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and silence. Emma Hawthorne owned it all: the house, the tech empire, the empty rooms. At 35, she ran Hawthorne Tech, a company that developed educational software used in school across the country, but her own son struggled in school, and she didn't know how to help him. She left for work before Lucas woke up and came home after he was asleep. It was easier that way, easier than looking into his eyes and seeing his father's face staring back. Lucas was 9 years old and had stopped smiling 3 years ago, the day a police officer knocked on their door with news about a car accident. He remembered his father's laugh, the way he explained things with patience and silly voices. After the funeral, his mother changed. She was always working, always tired, always somewhere else. Lucas started failing at school. His teachers said he couldn't focus, couldn't keep up, couldn't try hard enough. They put him in advanced math to challenge him, thinking he was just bored, but the numbers blurred on the page, and the tutor his mother hired only made him feel worse. Every red mark on his homework was proof of what he already believed. He was stupid, and no one could fix that. Daniel watched the boy from a distance during those first weeks. He recognized something in Lucas, a look he had seen before in his own son's eyes. Ethan was 7 now, bright and curious, but he had spent years believing he was broken. Dyslexia made reading a battlefield, and the schools had labeled him a problem child before he turned 5. Daniel had been a different man back then. Dr. Daniel Carter, a cognitive scientist at MIT with a promising career and a research partner he trusted. He spent 3 years developing a teaching method specifically for children like Ethan, kids who learned differently and needed someone to meet them where they were. The Carter method worked. It changed Ethan's life. And then Marcus Webb stole it. Webb had been Daniel's mentor, his collaborator, his friend. They had published papers together, shared grant money, built something that could have helped thousands of children. But Webb wanted more than shared credit. 4 years ago, he went to the university board with fabricated evidence, claiming Daniel had falsified research data. The accusation destroyed everything. Daniel lost his PhD, his reputation, his career. His wife left within the year, unable to handle the scandal. She didn't fight for custody, just signed the papers and disappeared. Daniel was left with nothing but Ethan and a method that now bore another man's name. The Webb method was being licensed to schools, integrated into software, celebrated in academic journals. And Daniel Carter was pulling weeds in a billionaire's garden, praying no one would ever recognize his face. He had no intention of getting involved with the Hawthorne boy, Staying invisible was the only way to protect Ethan. If Webb discovered where Daniel was, the lawsuits would start again. The accusations would resurface, and Daniel could lose his son. So he kept his head down, trimmed the hedges, and pretended not to notice when Lucas sat alone on the back porch every afternoon, hunched over his homework, with tears in his eyes. But one September afternoon, Daniel couldn't look away. Lucas was sitting on the stone steps near the garden, his math workbook open on his knees. Red ink covered every page. The boy was whispering to himself, the same words over and over. Daniel set down his gardening shears and moved closer, telling himself he was just going to check if the kid was okay. That was when he heard what Lucas was saying. "I'm so stupid. I'm so stupid. I'm so stupid." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He had heard Ethan say the same thing years ago, before Daniel figured out how to help him. A child convinced of his own worthlessness was a child on the edge of giving up entirely. Daniel looked at the workbook and immediately saw the problem. Lucas was working on 6th grade math, fractions, decimals, percentages, material designed for students 2 years older. The concepts weren't beyond him, but the way they were being taught made no sense for how his mind worked. The private tutor had just been drilling procedures without explaining why any of it mattered. Lucas wasn't stupid. He was drowning in a system that refused to throw him a rope. Daniel knew he should walk away. He knew the risk, but he also knew what happened to children who believed they were broken. They stopped trying, stopped hoping, stopped living. He had almost lost Ethan to that darkness. He couldn't watch it happen again. So Daniel sat down next to Lucas and picked up a handful of pebbles from the garden path. He asked the boy a simple question about the stones in his hand, and then he showed him fractions using something he could see and touch. Within 10 minutes, Lucas understood concepts he had been failing for months. The boy looked up at Daniel with an expression of pure shock, as if someone had just told him the sky was actually green and proved it. "I got it," Lucas whispered. "I actually got it." For the first time in 3 years, a small smile crossed his face. Daniel felt something crack open in his chest, something he had tried to keep sealed shut. He was in trouble now, and he knew it. The next day, Daniel's son Ethan wandered over to the main house while his father was working. Lucas was sitting alone again, and Ethan, who had never met a stranger he didn't want to befriend, introduced himself immediately. The two boys were different in almost every way. Lucas was quiet, withdrawn, careful. Ethan was loud, energetic, fearless. But within an hour, they were running through the garden together, laughing at nothing and everything. Lucas asked Ethan about school, expecting to hear about good grades and easy classes. Instead, Ethan told him about the years he couldn't read, the teachers who called him lazy, the feeling that his brain was broken. But his dad had taught him a different way, Ethan explained, and now he could read whole chapter books. Lucas stared at the younger boy with something that looked like hope, a fragile and dangerous thing. That evening, Lucas found Daniel in the garden and asked him directly, "Can you teach me like you taught Ethan?" Daniel felt his stomach drop. He thought about Webb, about the lawsuits, about the custody threats that could destroy his family all over again. He told Lucas no. The boy's face crumpled, and he walked away without another word. Daniel went home that night and couldn't sleep. He kept seeing Lucas on those steps, whispering that he was stupid. He kept hearing Ethan's voice from years ago, saying the same words before Daniel found a way to reach him. Some children fell into despair and never climbed out. Some children gave up entirely. Daniel knew what it meant to watch a child lose faith in himself, and he knew he was the only person in that mansion who could stop it from happening again. The next morning, Daniel made a decision that would change everything. He woke up before dawn, walked to the main house, and found Lucas already awake, sitting in the kitchen with his math book open. Daniel sat down across from him and started teaching. No whiteboard, no formal lessons, just pebbles and leaves and the sugar packets from the counter, turning abstract concepts into things a 9-year-old could hold in his hands. Lucas listened with desperate attention, asking questions, making connections, understanding. When Emma's car pulled out of the driveway an hour later, both of them were still at the kitchen table, unaware that they had just set something irreversible into motion. Daniel told himself it was temporary. He would help Lucas catch up, nothing more. He would keep his identity hidden, stay in the shadows, protect Ethan from the fallout. No one needed to know who he really was or what he had lost. But every morning, when Lucas looked at him with that mixture of gratitude and wonder, Daniel felt the walls he had built around himself begin to crack. He was a teacher again, even if no one could ever know it. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice kept warning him that secrets, this big, never stayed buried forever. The weeks that followed became a quiet revolution. Every morning before dawn, Daniel slipped into the main house through the kitchen door, and every morning, Lucas was already waiting for him. They worked at the kitchen table until they heard Emma's footsteps upstairs, then moved to the garden or the old tool shed, where no one would think to look. Daniel taught fractions with orange slices, geometry with sticks and string, probability with a worn deck of cards. He explained the Fibonacci sequence using pine cones and sunflowers, showing Lucas how math existed everywhere if you knew how to see it. The boy absorbed everything like soil after drought, desperate and grateful and growing stronger by the day. Emma noticed something shifting in her son, though she couldn't name it. He seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by the invisible weight he had carried since his father's death. She wanted to ask him about it, wanted to sit down and have a real conversation, but she didn't know how anymore. 3 years of distance had built walls she couldn't see over. So she did what she always did. She went to work, stayed late, told herself that providing for Lucas was the same as being there for him. The email from his school arrived on a Monday morning, and it shattered that illusion completely. The message was polite, but devastating. Based on his performance from the previous semester, Lucas's teachers were recommending that he be transferred to a special support classroom, a place for students who couldn't keep up with the standard curriculum. They cited his history of poor performance, his inability to focus, his pattern of failure. The evaluation had been completed weeks ago, before anyone noticed the quiet changes beginning to take root. Emma read the email 3 times, each reading making her feel more helpless than the last. Her son was brilliant. She had always believed that, even when his grades said otherwise. But belief wasn't enough to change the school's decision. She needed to do something, and she had no idea what that something was. Meanwhile, Lucas was changing faster than any report card could capture. He started smiling more, at first just during his lessons with Daniel, a quick grin when he solved a problem that had seemed impossible the day before. But gradually the smiles began appearing at other times too, at dinner, in the garden, even at school. His teachers noticed something different, but couldn't explain it. The boy who had been failing every subject was suddenly asking questions in class, challenging problems instead of shrinking from them. His recent quiz scores had climbed from failing to passing to something approaching excellence, though the official grades wouldn't reflect this until the next report. No one understood what had happened except Lucas himself, and he guarded the secret fiercely. Daniel was his, a treasure he refused to share with anyone who might take it away. While Emma struggled with the email, life in the garden continued its secret rhythm. Ethan and Lucas had become inseparable, two boys from different worlds who understood each other in ways no adult could. They played together every afternoon, building forts and chasing imaginary monsters and talking about everything and nothing. One day, Lucas asked Daniel a question that made his blood run cold. The boy looked up from his math problems and said, "How do you know all this stuff? Are you secretly a teacher or something?" Daniel forced a laugh and shook his head, telling Lucas he had just picked things up over the years. But the question stayed with him, a warning sign he couldn't ignore. He started being more careful, always watching the driveway for Emma's car, always ready to disappear into his gardening work at a moment's notice. The precautions weren't enough. On a Tuesday morning in late October, a teacher training day that had given Lucas an unexpected holiday, Emma's biggest client canceled their meeting at the last minute. She found herself with an unexpected free day and decided to go home, thinking she might finally have that conversation with Lucas. She pulled into the driveway at 10 in the morning, hours earlier than usual. The house was quiet when she entered, and for a moment she assumed Lucas was still asleep. Then she heard it. Laughter, coming from somewhere deep in the house. Her son's laughter, bright and loud and real. The sound stopped her in her tracks. She hadn't heard him laugh like that since before the accident, since before everything fell apart. Emma followed the sound through the hallways of her own home, feeling like a stranger in a place she no longer recognized. The laughter led her to a door she hadn't opened in 3 years, her husband's study, the room where he used to work late into the night, the room she had sealed shut after his funeral because she couldn't bear to see his empty chair. The door was open now. She could hear voices inside, her son's voice and someone else's. She moved closer, pressed herself against the wall, and looked through the gap. What she saw made her forget how to breathe. Daniel stood at the whiteboard that still hung on the wall, drawing a spiral pattern with careful precision. He was explaining how the shape appeared in seashells and hurricanes and galaxies, how mathematics was the hidden language of the universe. Lucas sat at his father's old desk, leaning forward with his eyes bright and his face alive with curiosity. He was asking questions, real questions, smart questions, the kind of questions that proved he had been thinking deeply about what he was learning. On the desk beside him lay textbooks that Emma recognized from her own college days, advanced mathematics far beyond anything a 9-year-old should be studying. This wasn't a gardener helping with homework. This was something else entirely. Emma pushed open the door, and both of them froze. Daniel's face went pale, the marker slipping from his fingers. Lucas jumped to his feet, positioning himself between his mother and his teacher, like a small soldier defending sacred ground. Emma demanded to know what was happening, her voice shaking with confusion and something that might have been fear. Daniel tried to explain, stumbling over his words, insisting he had only been helping with some basic concepts. But the evidence on the whiteboard told a different story, and they all knew it. Lucas cut in before Daniel could finish, his voice fierce and desperate. He told his mother that Daniel was the only person who had ever understood him, the only one who made him feel like he wasn't broken. The words hit Emma like stones. She ordered Daniel to leave the room. She needed time to think, time to understand what she had just witnessed. Daniel went without argument, his shoulders hunched with the weight of exposure. But before Emma could say anything else, she made herself look at her son. Really look at him, for the first time in longer than she could remember. She saw the light in his eyes, the confidence in his posture, the absence of the defeated slump that had defined him for years. Whatever Daniel had done, it had changed Lucas in ways she couldn't deny. She didn't fire the gardener that day. Instead, she started digging into his past. Determined to understand, who she had really hired. The search didn't take long. Daniel Carter's name pulled up dozens of articles, all telling the same story. A promising researcher at MIT accused of fabricating data, stripped of his credentials, disgraced and forgotten. Emma read the official accounts with growing unease. But then she found something else. Hidden in the depths of the internet were videos from years ago, lectures and presentations by a younger Daniel, explaining a revolutionary teaching method for children with learning differences. The comment sections were filled with testimonials from parents, hundreds of them, all saying the same thing. This method saved my child. Emma watched the videos for hours, comparing the passionate researcher on her screen with the quiet gardener in her backyard. The pieces didn't fit together the way the news articles claimed they should. She confronted Daniel the next evening, after Lucas had gone to bed. They stood in the garden under a sky full of stars, and Emma told him she knew who he was. She knew about MIT, about the accusations, about everything. Daniel listened without interrupting, his face unreadable in the darkness. When she finished, he didn't deny anything. He told her the truth instead, the real truth, the one that had never made it into the newspapers. He had developed that teaching method to save his own son, a boy with dyslexia who had been written off by every school he attended. The method worked so well that Daniel's research partner, a man he had trusted completely, decided he wanted it for himself. Marcus Webb had destroyed Daniel's career with fabricated evidence and stolen his life's work. Now, the Webb method was famous, and Daniel Carter was pulling weeds to pay rent. Emma asked why he had never fought back, never tried to clear his name. Daniel's answer was simple and devastating. Fighting would have meant lawyers, media attention, years of public battles. His ex-wife would have used the chaos to take Ethan away. So Daniel chose to disappear instead, to become nobody, to protect the only thing he had left. He looked at Emma with eyes that held no self-pity, only exhaustion. He told her he didn't need her to believe him. He just needed her to leave his son alone. Then he turned and walked back toward the cottage, leaving Emma standing in the dark with more questions than answers. 3 days later, the disaster Daniel had feared finally caught up with him. Marcus Webb was in town for a meeting with Hawthorne Tech, finalizing a deal to integrate his educational method into Emma's software platform. The meeting took place in Emma's office, and at some point, Webb's eyes landed on a photograph on her desk. Lucas smiling in the garden, with a figure visible in the background, a man with a rake in his hands. Webb recognized that figure. He would have known Daniel Carter's face anywhere. The meeting ended early, and Webb made a phone call to his lawyers before he reached the parking lot. The instruction was clear: eliminate Daniel Carter permanently. The legal notice arrived at Daniel's cottage 1 week later. He was being sued for inappropriate contact with a minor and for violating a permanent ban on educational practice that had been part of his original disgrace. The lawsuit was designed to destroy him. If Daniel lost, he would lose custody of Ethan. The accusations were false, but truth had never protected him before. Daniel read the documents with shaking hands, while Ethan played in the next room, oblivious to the hurricane about to tear through their lives. That night, Daniel made the only decision he could. He would leave before things got worse. He would take Ethan and disappear again, find another town, another identity, another life in the shadows. It was the only way to keep his son safe. The next morning, Daniel went to Emma and told her he was resigning. He didn't explain why, didn't mention the lawsuit, or Webb, or the danger closing in around him. He just said he needed to leave, and he apologized for overstepping his boundaries. Emma demanded answers, but Daniel refused to give them. He simply looked out the window at Lucas and Ethan playing in the garden, 2 boys who had become brothers without sharing any blood, and his silence said everything His words would not. Emma watched him walk away and felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Something was very wrong, and she didn't know how to stop it. Lucas found out that evening. He overheard Daniel telling Ethan to start packing, that they were going on a trip and wouldn't be coming back. The boy's reaction was volcanic. He stormed into the main house screaming, tears streaming down his face, demanding to know what his mother had done. He accused her of driving Daniel away, of ruining everything good in his life. And then he said the words that broke her completely. He shouted that she always made everyone leave, that she had driven his father away too. Emma felt the accusation tear through her like a bullet. She had never known that Lucas blamed her for his father's death. She had never known that her son had spent 3 years carrying that impossible weight alone. That night, Emma found the lawsuit documents. She searched through public records, made phone calls to contacts in the legal world, pieced together the truth that Daniel had been too proud or too broken to share. The person behind the lawsuit was Marcus Webb, her business partner, the man whose method she was about to integrate into her company's software. Emma understood now what was happening. Webb had discovered Daniel's location and was using the legal system as a weapon, the same way he had used it 4 years ago. If Emma stayed silent, she would keep her contract, her reputation, her company. If she spoke up, she could lose everything she had built. She sat alone in her office for hours, staring at a photograph of her husband that she kept in her desk drawer. She remembered the last words he had said to her before he left for work on the day he died. He had told her she was the smartest person he knew, but he had also warned her not to let that intelligence hide her heart. For 3 years, she had ignored that advice, burying herself in work, building an empire while her son fell apart. Now she faced a choice that would define who she really was. She could protect her business, or she could protect the truth. She couldn't do both. The photograph seemed to stare back at her, waiting for an answer. The story broke on a Thursday morning. Someone had leaked information to the press. Emma knew exactly who, and by noon, Daniel Carter's face was everywhere. The headlines called him a disgraced researcher who had infiltrated a billionaire's home, a fraud who had manipulated a vulnerable child for unknown purposes. Television reporters stood outside the Hawthorne estate gates. Cameras pointed at the mansion like weapons. Hawthorne Tech's stock price dropped 15% before the markets closed. Emma's phone rang constantly with calls from board members demanding explanations, from lawyers advising silence, from investors threatening to pull their money. She ignored them all. She was watching her son's door, waiting for him to come out, knowing he wouldn't. Lucas had locked himself in his room the moment he saw the news. Through the door, Emma could hear him crying, the sounds muffled but unmistakable. He blamed himself for everything. If he hadn't asked Daniel for help, if he hadn't needed so much, none of this would have happened. The person who had saved him was being destroyed, and Lucas believed it was his fault. Emma stood outside his room for an hour, pressing her hand against the wood, searching for words that might reach him. Nothing came. She had spent 3 years building walls between herself and her son. She didn't know how to tear them down in a single afternoon. At the cottage on the edge of the property, Daniel was packing. He moved mechanically through the small rooms, folding clothes and gathering books, trying not to look at Ethan's confused face. The boy didn't understand why they had to leave again. He had finally made a friend, finally found a place that felt like home. And now, it was being ripped away. Ethan stood in the doorway of his tiny bedroom, watching his father stuff belongings into boxes, and asked the question that shattered Daniel's heart. The boy wanted to know why they always had to run. Daniel had no answer. He had spent 4 years protecting his son from the truth. And now that truth was playing on every television screen in the country. He couldn't hide anymore. He could only disappear. Emma made her decision at 2 in the morning. She was sitting in her office, surrounded by legal documents and news printouts, staring at the photograph of her husband that she had pulled from her drawer. His words echoed in her mind, the warning he had given her on the last morning of his life. She had been smart for 3 years, ruthlessly smart, building her company while her son crumbled. Now, it was time to be something else. She picked up her phone and called the chairman of her board. Her voice was steady when she told him she was going public with everything she knew about Marcus Webb. If they wanted to fire her, she said, they were welcome to try. Then she hung up and started making a list of everyone who might help her prove the truth. The investigation took 72 hours. Emma hired private investigators, forensic accountants, digital specialists who could trace the origins of old files. She found the original emails between Daniel and Webb from 5 years ago, messages that clearly showed Daniel developing the teaching method, while Webb contributed nothing but criticism. She found the timestamp data on Daniel's original research videos, proving they had been created 18 months before Webb claimed to have invented the technique. And she found something else. A woman named Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a former colleague of Daniel's, who had witnessed everything and stayed silent out of fear. Emma flew to Chicago personally to meet with her. Dr. Mitchell was tired of being afraid. She agreed to testify. The press conference was held on a Monday morning, exactly 1 week after the scandal broke. Emma stood at a podium in the Hawthorne Tech headquarters, facing a room full of journalists who expected her to apologize and distance herself from Daniel Carter. Instead, she presented evidence: email chains, video timestamps, financial records showing how Webb had funded the original research theft. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward and told her story, how she had watched Webb steal Daniel's work, how she had been threatened into silence, how she had lived with the guilt for 4 years. The room erupted with questions, but Emma wasn't finished. She had one more piece of evidence to present. Lucas walked onto the stage. Emma had asked him the night before if he wanted to help, and he had said yes without hesitation. The boy who had hidden in his room for days, blaming himself for everything, now stood in front of cameras and microphones with his shoulders straight and his eyes clear. A whiteboard had been set up behind him, and Emma handed him a marker. She asked him to show everyone what Daniel Carter had taught him. Lucas turned to the board and began solving a problem. Not a simple arithmetic exercise, but a complex logical puzzle that most adults would struggle to understand. He explained each step as he worked, his voice calm and confident, demonstrating exactly the kind of thinking that Daniel's method was designed to develop. When he finished, he turned back to the cameras and spoke directly to the people watching at home. He told them he hadn't been taught to cheat. He had been taught to think. The room fell silent. Marcus Webb's world collapsed within 48 hours. The university that employed him launched an internal investigation. Former colleagues came forward with their own stories of stolen work and fabricated credentials. The lawsuit against Daniel was dismissed before it reached a courtroom. Criminal charges were filed instead, against Webb for fraud, defamation, and theft of intellectual property. Emma watched the news coverage with a feeling she couldn't quite name. It might have been satisfaction. It might have been relief. Mostly, it was exhaustion. She had risked everything to tell the truth, and somehow, against all odds, the truth had been enough. Daniel learned about his exoneration from Emma herself. She drove to the cottage where he was still packing, still preparing to disappear, and told him it was over. Webb was finished. The charges were dropped. His PhD would be restored within the month. Daniel listened without expression, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Then Emma offered him something he hadn't expected. She wanted him to join Hawthorne Tech as Director of Education, leading the development of software based on his own method, the real Carter method, finally bearing its rightful name. Daniel looked at her for a long moment before asking why she had done all this. Emma's answer was simple. She said he had given her back her son, and she didn't know any other way to thank him. Daniel shook his head slowly. He told her she had given him back himself. As far as he was concerned, they were even. 1 month later, the Hawthorne estate felt like a different place. The mansion that had been cold and silent for 3 years now echoed with footsteps and voices and laughter. Ethan and Lucas had become inseparable, 2 boys who understood each other's struggles and celebrated each other's victories. They studied together every afternoon at the kitchen table, Lucas helping Ethan with math, while Ethan practiced reading aloud from chapter books he could finally understand. Daniel had moved into the guest house, a proper residence instead of a gardener's cottage, and spent his days building the educational platform he had dreamed about for years. Emma came home early now. She had restructured her schedule, delegated more responsibilities, learned that her company could survive without her constant presence. Her son needed her more than her shareholders did. On a warm evening in early spring, Emma found Daniel sitting on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. She sat down beside him without speaking, and for a while they just watched the colors change together. Then Emma told him something she had been thinking about for weeks. She said she had spent 3 years being the smartest person in every room, building an empire, proving to the world that she didn't need anyone. But she had been wrong. She had needed someone to show her what she was missing, and Daniel had done that without even trying. Daniel turned to look at her, and his expression held something that might have been the beginning of an answer. He didn't say anything romantic. He didn't make any promises. He just told her that they both had a lot of rebuilding to do, and maybe they could figure it out together. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something better, an acknowledgement of possibility, of hope, of a future that neither of them had expected to find. The final image of that evening would stay with Emma forever. She walked back into the house and found Lucas at the whiteboard in his father's old study, the room that had been sealed with grief and was now alive with equations and diagrams. Her son was solving a problem that would have challenged a high school student, his hand moving confidently across the surface, his face lit with concentration and joy. Beside him sat Ethan, reading aloud from a book about space exploration, his voice steady and clear, no longer stumbling over words that had once seemed impossible. Daniel stood behind them both, arms crossed, a small smile on his face as he watched the 2 boys who had changed his life. Emma leaned against the doorframe, tears running down her cheeks, finally understanding what had left her speechless on that Tuesday afternoon 6 months ago. It wasn't Daniel's intelligence, though that had certainly surprised her. It wasn't even his teaching methods, revolutionary as they were. It was his courage, the courage of a single father who had lost everything and still chose to help a child who wasn't his own, who had risked his fragile safety for a boy he barely knew, who had dared to be exactly who he was, even when the world had tried to erase him. That courage had saved Lucas. It had saved Ethan. And somehow, without meaning to, it had saved Emma too.